In the fall of 2012, I had just left the job that I had, the pastorate that I had been at for 4.5 years at a church. And throughout this process, I had kind of been interviewing towards the end of that ministry after I had already resigned. I had been interviewing with another church. And it was for a number of reasons, it was a very long and drawn-out process. In fact, the whole process from beginning to end ended up being about 6 to 7 months. And there were, even though it was a long process, even though there were times in that process that I thought, well, maybe they're going in another direction, I was the candidate that they ended up flying in to have the job. And we had even began to prepare ourselves, because usually in the missionary church, which I was a part of, when you get to that stage, it's almost a done deal. So we had begun to prepare ourselves physically in terms of getting rid of stuff, mentally, spiritually, all of that, for picking up our family and moving. And what ended up happening is they ended up going in a different direction. They ended up hiring a candidate from within. It was a very difficult time in my life and in our family's life, to have begun to prepare yourself for one thing and to have something else happen altogether. If you've ever had expectations and hopes and ideas of what life is going to be like, and then all of a sudden those things don't happen, you know how difficult that can be. You have expectations and understanding of, oh, this is what my marriage or my relationship with this boyfriend or girlfriend is going to look like. This is my expectation, and all of a sudden, reality doesn't match expectations. Or you have this job, and you think it's your dream job, and like, this is it, and it ends up being a disaster. Or you have a loved one who passes away, and you say, well, I was planning to spend the rest of my life with him or her. I thought I had more time with him or her. Or we can look at the devastation that's being caused right now throughout so many islands in the path of Hurricane Irma. And in the midst of those storms, in the midst of the chaos, in the midst of those times when our realities don't match our expectations, it can be very easy to ask the question, where is God? Where is God in the midst of evil? Where is God in the midst of brokenness? In the midst of this world that is so screwed up, that is so a mess, where is God? I'm not sure if you've ever asked that question, where is God? For some, it is an avenue to completely losing faith, and for some, it is an avenue to greater faith. This morning, our ultimate goal is to shift us from asking that question, where is God, to become even deeper in our faith, to grow even more in our faith. And I think that begins when we shift the question from where is God in the midst of this tragedy, in the midst of this evil, in the midst of this heartache, when we shift from where is God to how is God. How is God at work in the midst of the chaos of our lives? How is God at work in the chaos of our world? Not that God in any way is causing a hurricane or causing evil, but rather that God is present and at work in the midst of it. And what does that mean for our lives? As we begin this series, Everyday Faith, our goal, our hope, is that you will enter into these spiritual disciplines, that you will enter into these avenues of deeper faith, that you'll become more aware of that question, how is God at work, so that ultimately you can be a part of what God is doing in this world. That we can have our eyes opened and become more aware of God's presence and how God is at work. One of the stories that we're going to look at this morning is 2 Kings. So if you have your Bibles with you, turn to 2 Kings chapter 6. If you don't have your Bibles this morning, it'll also be on your screen, or if you have your smartphones, whatever that looks like for you. 2 Kings, starting in chapter 6. There's a story about this man, this prophet of God, who had, we look at the prophets as spiritual giants, but these were men and women who practiced an everyday faith. They didn't overnight all of a sudden start hearing these voices. Imagine how messed up, how scared if all of a sudden you start hearing these voices. No, they had cultivated a relationship with God over time. They had cultivated these spiritual disciplines to hear from God. And this is the story of one man of God and what was happening in the world. 2 Kings chapter 6, and we'll be starting in verse 8. Now the king of Aram was at war with Israel. After conferring with his officers, he said, I will set up my camp in such and such a place. The man of God sent word to the king of Israel. So this is Elisha, the man of God. Beware of passing that place because of Arameans are going down there. So this is what's happening. The king of Aram says, all right, we're going to go to this place. The man of God says, hey, be careful. Be careful. So he's giving a forewarning to the king of Israel about what is taking place. So the king of Israel checked on the place indicated by the man of God. Time and again, Elisha warned the king so that he was on his guard in such places. So this is a sort of an early warning system. This is the early form of radar, right? This is a God-given radar so that the king of Israel knew where the king of Aram and his army was going to be and was able to move his army somewhere else. Because this was a bigger army. This was a better army, a more equipped army. This is the result. So imagine if you're the king of Aram now, and every time you go to a certain place, the army moves somewhere else. And so this enraged the king of Aram. He summoned his officers and demanded of them, tell me, which of us is on the side of the king of Israel? So there must be a traitor here, right? One of you is telling the king of Israel what's happening. It says, none of us, my lord the king, said one of his officers. But Elisha the prophet, who is in Israel, tells the king of Israel the very words you speak in your bedroom. Go, find out where he is, the king ordered, so I can send men and capture him. The report came back, he is in Dothan. Then he sent horses and chariots and a strong force there. They went by night and surrounded the city. Now imagine for a moment if you're Elisha, like you're feeding all of this information to the king of Israel. You know in some sense that there's going to be a big target on your back. And sure enough, that's what happens. You're in Dothan, and the king surrounds the city, surrounds this place. What is your attitude? Because you know they're after you. You're number one on their hit list. You are the most wanted individual because they know if they can get rid of you, they'll win the war. What are you feeling? What are you going through? What are you experiencing? Starting in verse 15. It says, when the servant of the man of God, so when the servant of Elisha, got up and went out early in the next morning, an army with horses and chariots had surrounded the city. Oh no, my Lord, what shall we do? The servant asked. So I think the servant has the natural reaction. Oh no. They found us. They've caught up to us. This is not going to end well. This was Elisha's reaction. And Elisha prayed. In verse 16. Don't be afraid, the prophet answered. Don't give in to those natural inclinations that you have. Those who are with us are more than those who are with them. So the natural reaction for the servant would be like, yes, but have you counted? Like, no, it's very clearly there are more of them than there are of us. And Elisha prayed this, open his eyes, Lord, so that he may see. Then the Lord opened the servant's eyes, and he looked and saw the hills full of horses and chariots of fire all around Elisha. See, Elisha had seen. Elisha was aware of the presence of God in the midst of this foreign army. He was aware of this army, this vast army that was surrounding them, protecting them. The servant was completely blind to it. Now, ultimately, what happens is the enemy does come down. Elisha prays, in the same way that you've opened the eyes of my servant, Lord, now blind them. And they do become blind, they become confused, and the whole army is captured, taken prisoner. All this is possible because God opens the eyes of a servant to become aware of God's presence among them. Not that God was the cause of this invading army, but that God was present in the midst of it. And because of that, Elisha is able to have a tremendous amount of peace. He doesn't fear, because obviously the army that is with us, the force that is with us, is much more powerful than the force that is with them. How many of us would love to just have our eyes opened to the reality of God's presence? How many of us would love to see, like, God, I really wonder, like, where are you at? Like, how are you working? Like, God, open my eyes. Help me to see so that I can, just like Elisha had, have peace in the midst of the storm. Have peace in the midst of what is happening. Because Elisha was so tuned to God's presence that he saw God at work. I think this comes through what I like to call, or what I've kind of labeled, vertical alignment. Vertical alignment is when we have known God, understood God, and experienced God in tremendous ways. So there are disciplines like reading Scripture and prayer and fasting and meditation that help us to become more attuned with God's presence in the world. It wasn't like Elisha woke up one day and all of a sudden he sees God at work. No. God was revealing himself. Elisha was daily practicing these disciplines, daily seeking God, and more those blinders became to be off, so that every day Elisha was living his life aware of God's presence, aware of how God was moving. I think so often we read our Bible for a week and we're like, oh, I haven't heard anything yet, and we give up way too easy. We give up our disciplines way too easy. It takes time to develop this vertical alignment, to come into alignment and to see God and how he's working and moving in this world in the midst of chaos. Elisha had open eyes. Elisha saw, and instead of being fearful, he was at peace. He had peace in the midst of an army. He had peace in the midst of a storm. When we've aligned ourselves vertically, we can have peace even in the most chaotic and difficult of times. That's the peace that only comes from God. The peace that doesn't make sense to our friends, doesn't make sense to our family, doesn't make sense to those around us who aren't already believers. Like, how can you be so calm? How can you have this hope? Why? Because I am experiencing the presence of God. And even though this bad thing is happening, I know that he is at work, that he is present in the world and in my life and all around me. Elisha was able to have peace. But it wasn't just being vertically aligned. It wasn't just being attuned to God's presence and how God is working. He also had what I'll coin horizontal movement. So Elisha, was involved in reconciling and restoring and renewing the world. And in the same, once we know where God is at work and how God is at work, once we've experienced that peace, then we can begin to move with God. Allow God to work through us. This happened with Elisha, right? Elisha had these prophetic messages, and he told the king of Aram, or the king of Israel, what the king of Aram was up to. Elisha heard and moved. He saw God at work and wanted to be a part of it. So often we think of spiritual disciplines as well. It's just me and my relationship with God, and it's all about the vertical. No. God also wants to work through us, to move us, to invite us to join his work of restoring and reconciling and renewing all of creation. Because here's the thing, there are things that we have gone through in our lives that have especially equipped us to minister to others. There are ways that you can minister to people that I never can, or that someone else never can. Why? Because maybe you've experienced God's presence in the midst of something horrible. Maybe you've experienced the death of a loved one, and so you can help someone else who's experiencing the same thing. Maybe you've experienced a loss that is great, or you've experienced a tragedy, or you've experienced something, or maybe you even went through the time in your own life of asking, where is God? And God now wants to move you on the other side, that your experiences can help others begin to see how God is at work in the midst of it. We align ourselves vertically with God. We focus on those disciplines of understanding and knowing God in a deeper way. And then we begin the work of reconciling and restoring and renewing all of creation to bring healing to those who are hurting, to be God's agents in the lives of others, to be maybe a visible symbol of God in someone else's life. See, there's a danger of only having the vertical. And so focusing solely on that, because we can seem uncaring and aloof. It doesn't matter what happens to the world. It's just about me and my relationship with God. And as long as we're good here, the whole world can just go to pot. It can just crumble and fall, and it can just. But as long as I'm good. Imagine what would have happened if Elisha would have just said, well, I've received this prophecy from God. I'm attuned to what God is doing, but, I don't care what happens to the king of Israel and his army. There's a man in the New Testament, a follower of Jesus, whose name was Ananias. And God very clearly spoke to him in prayer one day. He says, this is what I want you to do. And you're going to meet a man named Saul, a man who we maybe know better today as Paul. Paul was a persecutor of the church, had killed and been a part of the killing of many followers of Jesus. And all of a sudden, Ananias one day says, hey, I want you to go meet this guy. And this is what you're to do. See, Ananias could have said, well, I have this amazing prayer life. I'm not going to do that. No, but God wanted to use him. And Paul ends up being this amazing missionary for Christ. Imagine if Ananias had focused solely on his prayer life instead of moving as God wanted him to move. There's a danger in solely focusing on our vertical relationship with God. We've heard the phrase, so heavenly focused that we're no earthly good. That's the danger. That's the fear. That we're so vertically focused that we're no horizontally good. There's a danger in the other as well. We know lots of people in our world who are doing tremendous things. They've got the horizontal down pat. They're doing and doing and doing. But here's the question. Unless you've aligned yourself first with what God is doing, you're just doing things on your own. There's a danger in not aligning ourselves with what God is doing. There's a danger in even possibility that we're working against what God wants to do in this world. We must first align ourselves vertically so that we can more adequately and be better equipped to work horizontally in the world. There's also the danger of working really hard and getting really burnt out through doing good things because we've not gone deeper with God. We've not been sustained in our horizontal movement by God. We need His strength at times. We need His power at times to move and live and be and work and restore and renew and reconcile in this world. Both go hand in hand. Growing deeper in our faith and working with God in this world. Throughout the series, we're talking about spiritual disciplines. We're going to hear from a wide variety of voices. People who've gone through real struggles or people who've been moved at various times by specific spiritual disciplines. Some of those spiritual disciplines will be vertical, will help us to become more vertically aligned, and others will help us with that horizontal movement. But we invite you in. We invite you into a way of living, a way of disciplining yourself that over time will help you become more aware of God and how He's working in this world. This morning, as Anita comes, we've put up the prayer wall again. Because what we want to do is we want to invite you during this time, during this series, to simply lift up your requests to God. This morning, you may have something on your heart that is completely unrelated to this sermon. Some of us have family and friends in the path of Irma, or had them in the path of Harvey, or you just may be going through something in your life and you simply say, I need prayer. Like in the midst of this chaos in my life, like I need to feel God's presence in a whole new way. And so it's just a matter of writing those prayers down and lifting them up to God and say, God, I turn this over to you. I know that you are with me. Or maybe your prayer this morning is simply, God, help me to grow deeper during this series as I practice these things. Help me to become more aligned with your presence. Help me to see you in the midst of this chaos in the world. Or maybe your prayer this morning is this: God, I've aligned myself. I see you at work. Now help me to understand my role in this world. Help me to know my role in your work of reconciling and restoring and renewing creation. The prayer team will be up at the front. And I just invite you during this time to meditate, to pray, to seek God. And if you're willing, if you're desiring that, to lift up your prayers to God and to invite His presence to open your eyes to new realities.